Amen and good morning. Good to be with God's people. Amen? Amen. That is right. Now we get the privilege of going to his word together. We'll be in Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 8 today. And I know that we've had some people visiting, some people are kind of new into Habakkuk, so I thought it'd be helpful to kind of bring us through to verse 8 this morning. And if you remember, and sometimes it's hard for us to remember, I know as I go into study each week, and as the weeks go on, sometimes I go back and I reread each week from chapter 1 following, just to keep myself fresh on kind of what's going on. And as we came into Habakkuk chapter 1, we had this prophet who was wrestling, and he was wrestling with what he perceived to be injustice of God, and then also that coupled with the silence of God. And in response, he kind of let out this lament, and that's what we have in chapter 1 is his first lament that he releases. And as he lets out this lament, he becomes kind of shocked at God's response, because as God responds to him, he says, hey, I want you to look on the horizon because I'm raising up a nation, and it's the Chaldeans. And this nation is going to judge you. And that just startles the prophet. Why would he use Babylon as an instrument of justice? And so then Habakkuk responds with a second lament in verse 12. But in seeing God's justice and understanding God's wrath and curious about the way that God works, he responds in a right way. He says, are you not from everlasting in verse 12? O Yahweh, my God, my Holy One. And then he says that statement, we will not die. You, O Yahweh, have placed them to judge. So there's confidence in what God is doing. That his faith is not shaken in that way, but he's still in awe about what God is doing. And then in chapter 2, God calls Habakkuk to the tower to see not just what was happening, but give a clearer picture of what was coming, what was on the horizon specifically. And there we have this climax of the chiasm in chapter 2, verse 4, but the righteous shall live by faith. But then after he makes this proclamation that the righteous will live by faith, he begins to show these judgments that will coming in the effect of these woes. And these woes kind of roll out, and they become these storm clouds that kind of form as we get into chapter 3, where his justice and his wrath begin to be unveiled. And so we have this shift in chapter 3 then. And it's a prayer, and it's a song, and it's a hymn, and it's called a Shiggaion. And as we get into this, it's just this wildly spirit-filled, poetic, lamenting prayer that he lets out. But this is also a song that the congregation would sing together. And then in verse 3 through 7, it's almost as if I was envisioning it, the music would just kind of swell with majestic imagery of Yahweh in verses 3 through 7. And we looked at, behold, the Prince of Peace coming. Behold, Yahweh, this big procession of God as it marches forward. We kind of get that vision in verse 3 through 7. And so then God comes in this radiant splendor, and he shakes the nations, and the earth begins to tremble, and his glory outshines the sun. There's all of this dramatic imagery there. But as he gives us this imagery, he pulls in this imagery also of the Shema, this imagery of Sinai, this imagery of the Exodus and Canaan. And he wants this wrapped up in the imagery that we have, because it speaks to who God is, and it speaks to God's character. And so it's this holy unveiling, not just of God's might, but then the nearness of judgment. He wants us to feel that, and I'm sure that the music that would come along with this would make us feel that same thing as well. And so he has strength in his steps, and he has light in his hand, and then the earth begins to almost convulse as he walks forward. And so we have this grand prelude of God in verse 3 through 7. And then we have verse 8, which is so intriguing, because verse 8 then begins to be this introduction to the second half of this Shiggaion, this song. And not only that, it's an interpretive lens in which we look at the rest of the verses together. And so it becomes this scene setter almost to help us understand what's coming. And so now the question that is on Habakkuk's mind is no longer what do I see, but the question is why do I see it? And he begins to answer that in the first part of verse 8. And then how is it going to come about? And that's the second part of verse 8. And this is truly marvelous because as it sets the interpretive tone as we go through verse 8 through verse 19, it helps us understand God's character, specifically God's wrath, something that most of us probably don't spend much time meditating on or thinking about. And it helps us understand the character behind God's wrath. And it helps us to see that God's wrath is not arbitrary, but his wrath rides in intentionally. And as he rides in, I can almost picture it as being like this ride cymbal on a drum kit that carries this steady, unbroken shimmer, this pulse that anchors the music until the music comes to its end. It's kind of what this does, and it sets that tone as it underlays the rest of the verses. And so God moves, and he moves symphonically towards redemption all the way in verse 19. And so verse 8 serves as this sneak peek into what's coming. And it ends in this crescendo of salvation that we're able to look at. And I would think that the climax of the song would almost be in verse 13 through 15. And then I see in verse maybe 16, and then verse 17 through 19, we have this nice resolve of the music. And so we have this series of questions that comes out in verse 8. And these aren't typical questions. The best way to describe them as I read through them are just like almost astonished interrogations. I don't know how else to describe what these questions really represent. And what he sees there is that God's wrath is not reckless, but it's wonderful, it's wondrous, it's full of wonder. He looks at God's wrath and it makes his heart just skip a beat almost, and he looks in awe of God and who he is. And so verse 8 is crucial. It becomes the hinge between what God reveals in his glory in verse 3 through 7, and then what God does in judgment in verse 9 through verse 15. It's this hinge verse. And so as it all begins here with this vision of just this wondrous wrath, what happens is astonishing. Because the holiness of God awakens the soul to its greatest need. And that's really what this begins to do. It stirs within our soul, and then we begin to understand what our greatest need is as people. And in Habakkuk's vision, the congregation sings this. And then he sees clearly the purpose of God's judgment. And I can't help but think that the people singing it would also see clearly the purpose in God's judgment. And the beauty of that is that verse 8 then becomes like this underground river that swells, and it's full of marvel. And as it comes to the surface, it comes out in wonder. And then we see what the intentionality is behind verse 8 as we move through the rest of the verses. But we have to see verse 8 in its context and understand it in order to interpret correctly the rest of the verses as they move through. So if you would stand, we're going to read verse 8 together, and then we're going to walk through it carefully. This is the word of the Lord. Did Yahweh's fury burn against the rivers? Or was your anger against the rivers? Or was your wrath against the sea that rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation? Father, as we end right there with these questions that this prophet of yours begins to articulate, God, I can't help but think about our own weakness. Father, as we understand the reality of your word, as we begin to understand who you are in character, Father, the thing that comes ever before us is our weakness. Our weakness to understand, our weakness to comprehend, and our weakness even to climb to the summits. And so, God, as we desire to work out our salvation in fear and trembling, it comes before understanding you and your character and who you are. And that's what we ask this morning as we look at just your wrath before us. Help us to see it in the way that you want us to see it. Help us to understand it in a way that gives clarity to the gospel. Help us to understand it in a way that provokes us to desire to know you and to love you and to see the beauty and the majesty of who you are. And God, we know you can do that by your word and through your spirit. And so that's our request before you this morning as we go into the word together as your bride. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we have verse 8 this morning. It's number 1 in your outline. We have 2 points under that heading. And I put the rest of the outline there so you can see kind of where we're going in the weeks to come. But this I titled Wondrous Wrath. And we start with this kind of interrogation is the way I described it in the beginning. And we have Habakkuk standing. And as he's standing on the precipice of something that's just otherworldly. He's envisioning the wrath of God. If you want to try to envision that and see it in kind of a theophany and try to picture that and kind of what it looks like, that's what he's doing in his heart. And he's doing this not only in vision, but he's doing it musically, he's doing it poetically, he's doing it spiritually as he meditates on what this is. And so he uses 3 terms. And as he uses these 3 terms in fury and anger and wrath, it kind of builds in intensity and it kind of reveals then the purpose behind each one of these and what God is doing. And what's extraordinary is that this vision of God's wrath isn't hideous. It culminates in wonder and it draws us into him. It doesn't push us away as we think that it might do. And that's not generally wonder is not generally what we associate when we think about the wrath of God. But that's exactly what Habakkuk gives us. And that's exactly what we understand in his own heart as he comes to the resolve all the way then in verse 19. And so if you remember what wonder is, we talked about wonder a number of weeks ago, but wonder is a spiritual stillness of the soul. And it's summoned out of you whenever you're confronted with something that's truly amazing, that you can't truly comprehend in its entirety, but you try to. And then wonder is just summoned out of you, and it's this stillness as you look before this thing. And I've illustrated it different ways. And one of the things I was thinking about what wonder is, just to, again, kind of ground us in an understanding, I was thinking about our home in East Tennessee. And we lived in East Tennessee. We had this ranch-style home. It was positioned kind of on this hilltop. And in the front, it was a 70s home, I believe. And it was in the front and the back of the home, it was the windows on the front and the back of the home were just ceiling to floor. And the entire span of the room. So that's all you saw was glass. Out the front, out the dining room, out the front living area. And as you come around the hallway to the back, the whole back opened up and all you saw was just the mountains and woods, ceiling to floor. That was your panoramic view. We had no neighbors, so there's no curtains, no draperies, no anything. We just wanted to see outside. It was beautiful. And as you looked out the front of the house through those windows, there was 2 peaks of mountains that came down and they met and they crested right in the center, right in the front of the window, which I would think that's maybe why they positioned the house in that way. What's so amazing about that positioning of the house is the sun would rise there every single morning, right between those peaks. And so you would sit there before sunrise, which is a little easier to do in the mountains than it is on the coast. It's a little later in the day. But it would just the sun would just kind of spill over, and then the shades would change and the different hues and things that people try to mimic in art and things like that. But it's just truly wonderful as you see God just wake the world up in this way. As the sun just kind of comes up, and then the world just begins to start to come alive around it. And that's really what wonder is. And morning after morning, we would sit there in different ways, either going to work or whatever it may be, and it was often just quiet. And we would just stare and we'd just watch this. And our hearts were just full of wonder at God. And we thought about Psalm 19. There's all these things. And it compelled us to be a place where we want to read the scriptures as we watch the sun rise in this beautiful place. But that's what wonder is. It's this response of the soul when it's confronted specifically for believers with the beauty of God's purposes. When you see the purpose of something, it becomes wonderful. And Habakkuk sees the purpose of God's wrath, and that's what makes it wonderful to him. And so it summons this wonder out of him. And so Habakkuk gets this glimpse of God coming, and then he gets a glimpse of this wrath that's coming too, and he sees beauty in it. And it instinctively then produces this theological query. And that's what we have in these first three questions. They're more statements than they really are questions. But we have these three questions or these three statements. And so these series of questions are rhetorical. They have this interrogative ha that begins in the front of them. And it's meant to assume a negative answer, but then really grammatically why this is so significant is the whole point of the structure is to express from the writer's standpoint just complete astonishment and wonder. And that's the only thing they know to do on paper to make you understand that that's what they're feeling at that moment. And so that's why he words it the way that he does. And so Habakkuk isn't challenging God with the questions. You know, sometimes when we think of an interrogation, we think of challenging God. He's not challenging God with questions. He's trying to comprehend what he sees, the height and the breadth and the depth and the beauty. And so he does it in this grammatical form. And what he sees is just the wonder of God's wrath. And so we have these three questions, and they kind of escalate, and they're each beautiful different expressions that give us a different window into an understanding of God's character, specifically being his character of wrath. And so the first question draws out of our hearts into the reality that God's wrath awakens, and it's really because of the word he uses for fury. He said, "Did Yahweh's fury burn against the rivers?" Now, first, notice he didn't say burn against the river. He said rivers. So the question you should be asking hermeneutically is, okay, well, why does he say rivers? What does this stand for? Since it's plural, it stands for something. And so what it stands for is just places of power. And that's what we see in Israel's history. If you remember, he's pulling in the Shema. He's pulling in God and all he's done in the work through Exodus. And so in Israel's history, rivers weren't really obstacles before them, but they were places where God showcased his power before them. It's places where he drew out wonder from them. So we see that in the Nile in Exodus 7. When did the plagues against Egypt begin? When the Nile was struck and it turned into blood, and then the plagues came. In Exodus 7, verse 20, and all the water in the Nile was turned into blood. And so that awakened wonder. It awakened wonder in Egypt, and it awakened wonder within Israel too as they watched God begin to work. In Exodus 9, he says he did this so that you may know that there's no one like me in all the earth. He's speaking to the Egyptians. He's like, I want you to wonder at me. So I did this thing. I turned the Nile into blood. I brought these plagues on so that you would wonder at me. And so he awakens, and he's telling explicitly, this is why I did this. Because I want you to be awakened to the wonder of who I am. And it's coming through this justice. And so the plagues weren't necessarily just an act of justice of God or judgment, but they're revelations of his divine power through his justice. And then it evoked a spiritual response, and that was God's purpose, and that was God's intention. And it was the same thing with Israel in Exodus 14. When Israel saw the great power with which Yahweh had used against the Egyptians, the people feared, and they believed. And they also believed in Moses. And so they're like, okay, you have faith in this God. I'm following you. And this makes us tremble in fear and awe and wonder. So the text shows that Israel begins to see God for who he is, and Egypt experiences God in who he is. And so there was wonder that was awakened within Israel's heart. And so when Habakkuk says in verse 8, did Yahweh's fury burn against the rivers? He uses this word hara, and it means to kindle, to burn. But it more than that, it means to flare up instantly. And so it's drawing you down to a very specific, very intentional meaning. And it's talking about that initial ignition and how that initial ignition of fire draws your attention and kind of wakes you up. I was thinking about this in maybe a comical way, in that we have a burn barrel in our backyard. And what has now become a tradition in our home started out in an astonishment and wonder, you could say. I was going around the yard and I was picking up sticks and leaves and I was putting them in the burn barrel. And, I grew up on a farm for a little bit and in a welding shop. And so I understand fire, I understand how these things work, just so we understand and know those things. And so I was putting it in there, and as I was putting it in there, the reason I say that is because I use an accelerant. And as I used an accelerant in there, I also used a long fuse, about 50 feet, drew all the way back because I knew what happens. I wasn't expecting what happened with this, and I lit it, and I watched it go down, and as soon as it hit the barrel, it exploded. And it shot the leaves and the sticks higher than the trees that are in our yard. It shook the windows on the house. Everybody ran outside. They're like, "Are you okay? What happened? What's going on?" That initial flare-up that draws everyone's attention and awakens and shakes everybody is exactly what this word means. It's talking about that moment that everyone's startled and they turn and they look. That's what this fury is. That's what hurrah is. In Exodus 32, verse 10, "Now then, let me alone, that my anger may burn against them, that I may consume them, that I'll make you a great nation." So remember, this is where they turned away from him. But he uses that word, my anger, let my hurrah, let me awaken them to the wonder of my justice because of the way in which they turned against me. Let me ignite within them a sense of awe of who I am through my judgment, is what he was saying in that verse. And so Habakkuk presents the same question. And he says, did Yahweh's fury burn against the rivers? He knows that God's wrath isn't against nature itself. There's a curse that nature endures, but its wrath isn't against nature. So, of course not, is the answer to that question. Of course not. But he uses the rivers to stir up the wonder through his justice and through his wrath of the people around. And so the God who once judged Pharaoh by the waters, now he prepares to do the same thing to Babylon. And he's letting the people know that the same thing, the Shema that came, the Shema that delivered you, is the same Shema that is going to deliver them. So it's the same power, new enemy, same goal. The world is going to wonder at me. So the first question lets us know that God's character, God's wrath specifically, is meant to awaken us, to shake you awake, to make you see him. And then he gives us another word that helps us understand that his wrath, in a different sense, is also personal. He says, or was your anger against the rivers? And as he uses this word for anger, it's talking about hot anger. It's talking about, the vision is like of flaring nostrils. It's an emotion that's oriented towards a personal grievance, but there's a lot of grief and sorrow kind of mixed in with it. And that's really the word that he uses there. And it's in Deuteronomy 6, verse 15, it says, the anger, and it's af is the word, of Yahweh your God will be kindled against you. So he's like, Moses, don't forsake your first love. And as you go into Canaan, make sure that they don't forsake their first love, because my anger, it's a personal anger, will burn against you. And so this af has a really important function, because we have another layer, if you want to look at it as an onion, of looking at God's wrath as an onion, unlayering the different aspects of it. It shows that his anger is relational. It's not impersonal, it's relational. Whenever he has his wrath against somebody, it's a personal grievance. He's personally offended, and that's exactly what sin is. Sin is a relational violation of his glory, his character, and his law. You're going absolutely against his will, and he is the sovereign. And so when you go against his will, then it's a relational violation. I love what Jonathan Edwards says about this. He says, sin is an opposition to God's very being and his excellence. It is a setting up of one's own will and desires against the will of an infinite, majestic God. And so that's why David says in Psalm 51, against you and you only have I sinned. I know I sinned against these people. I know I've done these things, but Yahweh, you and you alone have I sinned against. David recognizes that it's a personal sin against God, and so he goes and confesses that first. You see the same thing in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 2. Sons I have reared and brought up, but they have revolted against me. They have abandoned Yahweh. And so he's seeing this as a personal betrayal. Israel is personally betraying him. And so God's grievance is pictured there as like a faithful father who has been loving, who has been just, who has been kind, who has raised his children in the word, and then they wrongly abandon him and they treat him in an inappropriate way. And so it's relationally charged. It's not, we think about God's justice and his wrath as legally driven, but it's also relationally charged. And Hosea, if any other book of the Bible presents that, it surely does. In chapter 1 through 3, we have this picture of idolatry. And it's a personal idolatry against God himself, against Yahweh. And so his grievance against Israel is personal. It's not sinful. It's not sinfully emotional. It is emotional, but it's a holy grief, and it's personal. In Hosea 11, verse 8, he says, my heart is turned over within me. He's like, I have this grief whenever I look at my people and the way that they've turned against me. My heart turns over within me. And he's grieving Israel's betrayal. You know, this isn't like our grievances. Our grievances are steeped in pride, right? Personal offenses against us. Not the holiness of God, not even righteousness. It's maybe our own righteousness that we think we've set up in some shape, form, or fashion, usually just spurned on by idolatry. But God's grievances are rooted in his holiness. That's why Romans says the wrath of God is revealed against ungodliness, right? Unrighteousness. That's where his wrath is directed against that specifically. And so his wrath is necessary, and it's a holy response to what contradicts his nature. And so we understand what that is. And God's anger is relational, but this word also helps us understand that it's not just relational, it's also covenantal. And so the anger of God is always tied to his covenant love, and that comes out in two different aspects. One, when his people are dishonored, and another one when his people dishonor him in a covenant relationship that's bound together in love. And so we have those two aspects of this word as well. In Zechariah chapter 1, verse 14, thus says Yahweh of hosts, I'm exceedingly jealous for Jerusalem and Zion, but I'm very angry. And he uses that word again. With the nations who are at ease, for while I was only a little angry, they furthered the disaster. So he's saying, I used them, I raised them up as a judgment against my people, and they took it further than I wanted them to take it. So now my anger is kindled heavier against them for what they've done. And so God is also grieved when his people dishonor him specifically in Ezekiel 6. Then those of you who escape will remember me among the nations to which they will be taken captive. How I've been hurt, he says. And he's talking about this emotional pain that he feels by their adulterous hearts, which turned away from me, and their eyes, which played the harlot after their idols. And they will loathe themselves in their own sight for the evils which they have done, for all of their abominations. So God says, I'm brokenhearted over my people in the way that they've violated the covenant that they've made with me, the promise that they've made with me. And so this grief is relational grief based on this promise that they've made. And so he stands there brokenhearted in this anthropomorphic sense. And so in the end, it's helpful to understand that God's anger is seen specifically, relationally, and not just mechanical. And I think sometimes we think about God's wrath, we can dismiss it as mechanical and judicial, and we forget the relational aspect of it. And this comes in to play soon, right? We'll talk about it here in just a few minutes. But it comes into play soon why this is so important. It's not a fitful passion, but just this personal displeasure of God. And so when he witnesses this deep, passionate anger, what Habakkuk realizes is that it rises out of loyalty and it rises out of love. And so then it causes the people, when they understand this aspect of his wrath, it causes them to wonder. As it causes them to wonder, they begin to think about all the Shema again. They're thinking about the Jordan River crossing, right? And so he says, your anger against the rivers. And so you think about how God delivered them through the Jordan. You see this all the way back. When God said, I will deliver my people, and these people have sinned against me, in Genesis 15, verse 16, then the fourth generation they will return here for the iniquity of the Amorite. And so then in the time of Joshua, the crossing of the Jordan began the mark of the beginning of that anger being unleashed on these people. And so when the people crossed the Jordan, they knew what was happening in Joshua chapter 5. Now it happened when the kings of the Amorites and all the kings of the Canaanites heard how Yahweh had dried up the waters of Jordan, their hearts melted and there was no spirit within them. And it evoked a sense of wonder in them with fear. So the nations began to tremble because God's personal anger was now advancing on them in the form of these people coming to judge. And so Habakkuk and the congregation sing about this. In verse 8, or was your anger against the rivers? And so Habakkuk knows that nature isn't triggering God's anger, right? He understands that. He's using the nature and the rivers specifically about how God's wrath awakens the soul and that it's personal in its approach. And then he goes on to say how it's overwhelming. He says in verse 8, or was your wrath against the sea? Avrah is the word here, and it means to overflow, to overwhelm, to go beyond the boundaries, and to keep going is what it is. And so it's this overflowing stage. It's just this flood-like fury is basically the way that you can understand it. It's an overwhelming force. And so in conjunction with the sea there, we begin to see that he's speaking about the span of God's force. He goes from the rivers now to the sea, to the oceans. And he's saying, isn't your wrath against the sea? Job 21, verse 30, gives an understanding of this. He says that the wicked is reserved for the day of disaster. They will be led forth at the day of fury. And you could literally kind of interpret that word as a violent flood. They will be led forth in a violent flood. In Isaiah 30, verse 27, behold, the name of Yahweh comes from a remote place. So there it is. It's way far off, just like in Habakkuk's vision. His anger is burning and desire with smoke. His tongue is like consuming fire, and his breath is like an overflowing torrent. Kind of the same word there. God's wrath is compared to this massive storm surge, like the tsunami that comes in. And so this fits the tone of Habakkuk 3, where the whole earth is trembling as Yahweh's wrath is coming forward. And it has this kind of apocalyptic sweep over the land, sweep over the sea and the sky. And we begin to understand that it's God's unrestrained anger. It's like the epitome of his wrath is this unrestrained anger. And it's like when the dam breaks and kind of moves through an area, it's just devastating as it goes through. But the difference is there's an aspect of this word that makes us understand that there's no casualties. It is precise and it's intentional. It never goes outside of the bounds in which he wants it. It's the flood-like torrent, but it's going exactly where he wants it to go. It's calculated. And this invokes overwhelming wonder. You can't help but think about, with the Shema vision, the Red Sea crossing, right? While we understand that the word he uses for wrath doesn't show up in Exodus 14, the theology is there, and the reason we know that the theology is there because the interpretation from Psalm 78, verse 49, where it is used. He said upon them his burning anger, his wrath, Havrah, and indignation, but he led forth his own people like sheep. So there he's describing Egypt's judgment and how Israel moved through, and he's looking back to Exodus 14, so we know that his overwhelming wrath was used there theologically in the same sense. And so this wrath poured out on Egypt, but salvation poured out on Israel. Exodus 15, verse 14, the peoples have heard. He's talking about the nations. So when they went through on dry ground, the entire globe heard about what God did. And it says, when they all heard, the nations have heard. They heard about God's Red Sea wrath. They heard about the people walking through on dry land. They heard about Egypt being swallowed up. It just caused global wonder at God. And even later, Rahab recalls this moment in Joshua 2, verse 10. For we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you. And we heard it, and our hearts melted. And no courage remained in any man. She's like, this is what happened in my land as we heard about the Red Sea wrath of God. We began to shake. we began to tremble and wonder at who this God is that's coming with Israel. So God's wrath at the Red Sea wasn't cruelty. It was overwhelming glory. That's the purpose of this. That's why he allows his wrath to go forth, is to cause this overwhelming glory so that we see him and we wonder at him. And so God's wrath overwhelmed the Egyptians. And in that moment, the nations feared and Israel saw something. And what they saw, they could never unsee. And that was God's purpose. I want you to see who I am. I want you to see the great I am. I want you to understand my covenantal love for you. I want you to understand my relational love for you. A holy God whose wrath is just as overwhelming as his mercy is what they saw. And so Habakkuk's song gives us the image of this wondrous wrath of God. And we have these three questions, and they kind of build an intensity. And we have these three descriptions of God's wrath. And God's wrath awakens in fury, and it's personal in nature, and it overwhelms against the seas. And so we've seen why God's wrath is so wonderful. Now we get to see how it evokes this wonder. And this is interesting. Maybe it's just interesting to me, and you guys get to listen, but this is so interesting. He says, that you rode in on your horses and on your chariots of salvation. It all hinges on the word that. The word that he uses for that here is the word key. And it helps us understand that these are what goes before it is theological declarations, not necessarily just interesting questions, but they're theological declarations. And normally when this word is used, it's causal. So the word because would be interpreted in that space. We see that in Genesis 3:15. Then Abraham said, then to Abraham he said, because, key, you have listened to the voice of your wife and you've eaten the tree, curses the ground because of you. And so then because, so we see that as causal, but this is used in Habakkuk 3 in a very rare sense, and I can't help but think it's because it's in a Shiggaion, and who's heard of that either, right? So it's used in a very rare sense then, in the sense that it's used as a relative pronoun. It's not telling why something happened, it's telling how it's happening. And this is significant because this is the pivot of Habakkuk's logic. He begins to change then. It magnifies the wonder behind what God is trying to drum up and for them to understand. And what we begin to see is that God's wrath is not sloppy, right? We think about God's wrath, and he's bringing it down to just a pinpoint understanding. And when we think about God's wrath, we think about human wrath, right? And when we get angry, man, everything in our way gets into it, right? And there's shrapnel everywhere. Everyone gets in the crosshairs and crossfire of everything that's going on. Just kind of just rage and fury. That's not what Habakkuk is trying to show that. He's trying to show that God's wrath is something different. In our wrath, no one escapes the injury. It's reactionary, it's uncontrolled, it's damaging in the way that it comes forth. And we have goals in mind whenever we give our wrath, right? We want to hurt the people around us because we feel justified in it. We want to prove that we are right, and we want to win this argument. And so we're going to weaponize our anger in this moment to get what we want. And so then we read about God's wrath, and we're like, wow, I don't know that I like a God who has has wrath. And Habakkuk's like, you actually don't understand what wrath is the problem. Because it's nothing like your wrath. Our wrath is this blunt force instrument that we use. And God's anger is like a scalpel in the hand of a seasoned surgeon. It does hurt. There is pain involved in it, but it's precise in its incisions, and no one gets caught in the crossfire. There's no shrapnel on the outside of that. When God exercises his wrath, it's meant to purify, it's meant to redeem, and it's meant to restore people specifically. That's why his wrath goes forth. His wrath is never impulsive. It's not like man's wrath. It's explosive and self-centered. Divine wrath is always measured. It's always just. It's always in perfect harmony with his own divine will. Nahum chapter 1, verse 2, Yahweh is jealous and avenging God. Yahweh takes vengeance on his adversaries. Yahweh is slow to anger and great in power. And so slow tells us that it has this patience that's involved with it, but then great in power is actually a word that talks about the vision there is the preciseness of it. And so it builds slowly, and when it's executed precisely. And so God's wrath is wonderful because it's very specific. It is personal. It is all-invoking. It is all of those things. It's even overwhelming in its extent, but it has a very specific goal in mind. And so if you understand theologically the purpose of God's wrath, the goal of God's wrath is redemption. Praise God. That's the goal of God's wrath. Not just unleashing fury, but to redeem a people. And it's the key. It's that helps us understand that God's wrath is aimed at a very specific thing. It's delivering salvation specifically. And this is what causes Habakkuk to wonder that this God is going to come and save his people. And so he says, how does this happen? He says, you rode in on your horses, Rechab. It's talking about just this imagery of kingship and royalty that they used to ride in on horses. Maybe you're familiar with that. But it's just this divine theophany, and God is coming, and it's the same imagery you see in Psalm 18, verse 10. He rode on a cherub and flew, and he sped on the wings of the wind. So David's giving thanks for the deliverance of God and how God delivered him. But while he's doing that, he first recounts the danger, kind of like what Habakkuk does, is then the earth shook and quaked, and the smoke went up from his nostrils, and he bowed the heavens also and came down. So the heavens then become this bow and arrow that he's using to judge, and it's talking about this cosmic upheaval in response to David's cry. And David's like, my God heard me, and he came and he delivered me. And so God's scene is just coming down in this majestic, angelic power on this cherub. If you remember from Ezekiel, they have wings and faces and wheels, and they become this mobile platform for the throne of God. And he says, he whisks down, and he came to me and delivered me in the midst of the shaking mountains and the darkening of skies. He rode, the same word, Rechab. And so he's riding. And so we see Yahweh is this divine warrior that's coming in, and he's advancing in response to injustice, and he's doing this in a majestic way to save. And in both instances, what's interesting, it's God himself that's coming. He's not sending people to come. God himself is coming. He says, you come. He rode. And so he rides in himself. And so his justice is personal, and it's active, and it's majestic. In Deuteronomy 33, verse 26, there's none like the God of Israel who rides the heavens to your help. This is Moses' final doxology. And he gives this picture of God, this mighty warrior mounted on the horse, and he says he's coming in to rescue you. And so we have this theophany, this warfare language, and it has this very specific theological significance. And it shows that there's this vision of peace wrapped up in this wrath of God and in this war that's coming. And it's coming personally, and it's coming swiftly. And so he continues with the imagery and says horses. And I don't know if you've ever been in front of a horse that's galloping, but it's going to cause you to turn around for a minute because it's loud and it's clunky, and you realize that they are clumsy and they don't know when to stop all the time. So you have, and he says there's horses behind you. And what is so great about this, the poeticness of this, is it's a tables turned of the echoes of Egypt. And so in Egypt, right, the horses and the chariots pursued Israel. And what does God say now? My chariots and my horses are coming for you. And so you're going to feel what that feels like. You're going to hear my horses come behind you. And so his wrath doesn't just hover in the heavens, it advances. And as it advances in these wonderful ways. And so in Habakkuk, Yahweh rides in, and he does this in a very symbolic way. And the horses that Egypt trusted in, he turns this into a vehicle of salvation for Israel. And this is why God must be seen as wonderful, because his wrath always makes way for salvation. That's what his wrath does. Whenever we see him in verse 3 through 7, that procession of Yahweh, he's making a way for salvation as he comes. And we see that so clearly in Habakkuk. We see the historic aspect of it in Exodus. We see the prophetic aspect of it in Judah's going to be delivered from Babylon. But then there's these shadows of this future ultimate fulfillment. And so he says his chariots roll with purpose in verse 8b on your chariots of salvation. So we understand what's happening now. Salvation is coming. This is redemptive intent of God. And I love the way this sounds in Hebrew. Merkava Yeshua. The chariots of salvation. And if you're familiar at all with the Semitic language, you know that the root word of Jesus is Yeshua. Salvation, Yeshua. Jesus, Yeshua. Psalm 3:8, salvation, Yeshua, belongs to Yahweh. And so Matthew joins these and helps us to see them together. You shall call his name Yeshua, and he will save Yeshua, his people, from their sins. And so Matthew connects the name and the root of that, showing that the name is the mission. So salvation is the mission. When Jesus comes, salvation is the mission. And so the wrath of God is wonderful because it's bringing Yeshua to us to save us. And so God's wrath is not opposite of his love. We think about it as something contrary to love. It is the divine expression of his love because he's coming to save. And so God's fury and his anger and his wrath are burning against his great opponent. And we know that that's not just Babylon, but it's who Babylon serves. Babylon serves Satan, their master. And God is coming. And he's coming riding on a horse, and he's going to face his great opponent. And so Jesus is coming to save his children. And so in the midst of this verse 8, what we have is this vision of the Messiah coming in to save us. And so Habakkuk's vision doesn't start and stop with the Chaldeans. It begins with the Shema, bringing in the Old Testament. So we see the imagery of God delivering his people. Then it foreshadows the coming of the judgment of Babylon. But then it foretells of this warrior coming to rescue us at the cross. And so there we have the pinpoint place in which God's wrath is going to be directed. And we see that move through those words. His fury, its awakening, his anger. As his anger comes up, it begins to help us understand the reality of the wrath of God and then its overwhelming nature. And so we have this picture of really universal history as it moves through. And so we have the awakening of understanding who God is. And then we have the anger of God revealed specifically and pinpointedly directed towards, first and foremost, his son to bring salvation, but it's not going to end there. The wrath of God against the sea will come in the end of time whenever he comes and with overwhelming glory overcome his adversaries, cast them into eternal damnation, and bring his children into glory. And so we see all of this in this verse. And it's a beautiful movement of this wildly passionate hymn. And so in verse 8, we have this scene that's set. And we have this vision of the wrath of God. And so the questions posed is, why is Yahweh riding forth in fury? Why does he want to awaken us? Well, then the question is answered because he wants to save us. That's why he's coming. And so then verse 9 through 13, which we'll cover the next time we're in here together, I've entitled that section, This Big Cosmic Confrontation. There we have where they meet at the cross. And God's wrath, the point of his wrath, comes to its head, and the purpose is revealed in the salvation of his children through the punishment of his own self. God himself rides in, and as he himself rides in, he saves us from himself. And so embedded in that, in verse 13b and following, is the triumph of God. You crushed, he says in verse 13, the head of the house of the wicked. And so we have that final triumph revealed. What a glorious picture that Habakkuk has in just one verse. The entire scriptures and all of the gospel and the point of the wrath of God and the purpose as it lays out in time is just in verse 8. And so we go from here today and it encourages me because of what we have before us, this glorious picture, and just the fury, the anger, and the wrath. Because it lets us know that God's chariots are coming. His chariots are ready, and Yeshua stands at the helm. And he's waiting for the Father to say, go get my children. And bring them home. And once he does that, an overwhelming rage of fury will be unleashed against evil. And we will watch. I love Habakkuk.